Now, my next guests have the exact same job, but their backgrounds are far different. One comes from a family long in American politics, the other a newcomer who upended a longtime incumbent. They're the youngest members of the Massachusetts delegation. Congressman Joe Kennedy, who represents the 4th District. Good to see you, Congressman.
Always a pleasure, my friend.
And Congressman Seth Moulton from the 6th. Good to see you both, guys.
Good to be here.
So the hottest, let's talk current events for a couple minutes. Biggest story in America is that story. Look at the smile on his face. So mete out the penalty, Joe Kennedy. You're a fair guy. What happens to your guy, Tom Brady?
We'll see. I don't.
He's going to dance. I know this. Go ahead.
No, look. I think Tom answered some questions very clearly at the press conference before the Super Bowl. He said he had nothing to do with it. The report, at least parts of it that I've seen, not a good report, but Wells was very clear that they don't have direct evidence that he did anything. So I think, look forward to Tom's comments at some point on this. I think he should speak on it. But the last thing I'd say on it, I watched that Colts game. I watched that Super Bowl. They won both games, and they got better throughout the day of the Colts game.
He'd be a great defense lawyer someday. So what penalty comes out of you, Seth Moulton?
Look, I think it's tough to say whether Brady himself was involved, but it's clear the Patriots don't need to cheat to win, and they shouldn't do it. If it seems that they did, then they ought to have a penalty.
Very politic, you two. Thank you very much. Let's stay on current events. Federal Appeals Court today rules that a provision of the Patriot Act that allows NSA collection of bulk phone records of Americans is illegal. No injunction, though. You guys are going to get to vote on whether to extend that provision in the Patriot Act come June. How are you going to vote and why, Seth Moulton?
Well, we'll see what bill is actually put before us. But this is a very tough debate. I think it's very important that we do whatever we can to protect the national security of the United States. And the reality is there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that most of us don't know about and that's enabled by this act. But I'm also very concerned about privacy. And it's going to be tough. I can't say.
Is the court right today that this is illegal in your estimation? This bulk collection?
I certainly share the court's concerns. I mean, we can't go so far towards, away from the basic constitutional provisions that Americans expect that we become some security state.
How are you going to vote, Joe Kennedy?
Jim, I voted to end the practice of bulk collection before. I think we're ready to end the practice of bulk collection now. I think there's parts of Section 215 that does more than just the bulk collection of data, which is what the court basically said in the ruling today was illegal. Their law, or the bill that's coming before the House in the next couple of weeks, I think does a number of good things. I don't think it quite goes as far as I would like it to, but I'm still evaluating it. I think it went through a markup last week.
Have you moved on this issue? You were the only member of the Mass delegation prior to Seth Moulton being around that actually voted against the provision that would have taken away the power of the NSA to collect this surveillance, monitor phone calls for someone not accused of an illegal act. Do you regret that vote now or no?
No, I don't. Not at all. What I did, Jim, when I voted against the knee-jerk reaction of ending this practice, government practice of bulk collection, that was after about 10 or 15 minutes of debate on an unrelated bill after these revelations came to light, which many of us in Congress didn't have any idea about. And that's not the way you do national security. So I've dived into these issues over the course of the past couple of years. I also think, Jim, the process on this matters, and you got to make sure that if you put the processes in place, you try to get more disclosure from the FISA court opinions. You try to put in a privacy advocate.
The secret court that approves this stuff. Yeah.
And you try to put in a privacy advocate so that there's somebody else arguing the other side. There's reforms that can be made so that you strike the balance that Seth, I think, is talking about here. So
understood.
And Jim, I wasn't in Congress then, but I agreed with Joe. I said I would have voted the same way.
Same way he did.
That's right.
Tsarnaev, you both come out against the death penalty for this guy. Do you think Carmen Ortiz, the U.S. Attorney, should have taken more into account the fact that the public in this state, and Greater Boston in particular, is overwhelmingly against administering the death penalty to this guy? You're a former prosecutor.
I am, and I'm against the death penalty. I think, we've talked about this, Jim, I've got an awful lot of faith in our system. It's still a human system, and it does, we've seen, death row inmates, it does make mistakes. I don't think I don't think there's any doubt as to, in this defendant, in this case, whether he did it. I think he did.
Well, he's admitted he did it.
Well, so I think that I don't want to second guess the judgment of Ms. Ortiz and the prosecutors on the case as to all of the factors that go into it. I do not support the death penalty.
But, do you want to second guess her? I mean, the public here, not by majority, overwhelmingly says below 20%, and it's surely not because they're in any ways justifying the horrors committed by this guy and his brother. Should Ortiz have taken that into account before she went to the U.S. Attorney General and said, we should execute this guy?
Well, I've never I've never been in her shoes, but to me that would make sense. There's some people who probably look at this as a case not just for Boston, but for the rest of the United States. But I'm against the death penalty as well. I don't think that. I think 50 years from now we'll look back at this and say that even prosecuting him with the death penalty in mind was a mistake.
Speaking of this, just staying with this for a second, I was surprised to read both of you having reservations about having cameras in federal courtrooms. You're a practicing lawyer. What reservation? They're in state courtrooms, and I heard you wrote something concerned about witnesses. I'm not belittling your concern, but why are they okay in state courtrooms, and why shouldn't we be able to see what's going on in Tsarnaev and Whitey Bulger and Sal DeMacy? What's the deal, Congressman?
You're a former lawyer as well. I think we're both recovering.
Former is correct.
We're both recovering. So, Jim, I think there's a couple of concerns that I think are particularly to federal courtrooms. One, you've got large jurisdictional issues. So when you're dealing with racketeering cases, when you're dealing with major crime units, when you're dealing with organized crime that happens to have cross-jurisdictional boundaries, having the juror's identity perhaps exposed through those cameras, having witnesses' identity exposed through those cameras, I think that does bear a very real risk if it does get disclosed. I would certainly look at any legislation that comes up to say, look, we're going to give discretion of this to a federal judge or the magistrate.
You'd vote for that
I would,
to allow the judge to decide.
I would look at the wording of that legislation because, look, I would genuinely like to know what was going on in the courtroom other than following live tweets, and whether it's this case or Whitey Bulger. So I've got I think the public on the one hand has a right to know. I think we have to balance the very real concerns about public safety and the safety and confidentiality and privacy of witnesses and
What
victims.
reservations do you have? Every state court in America has a camera in it, fairly unobtrusive. What's your concern?
Jim, when I was elected, I said that I'm going to make decisions based on the facts, not what one interest group says or the other. And I'm also going to be honest when I'm not an expert on the issue. So in this case, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a former prosecutor, so I picked up the phone and called a former prosecutor to ask for his advice. And frankly, I agreed with what he had to say.
Which is?
Which is Joe.
Are you open-minded and at least giving the judge discretion, or you're not even open-minded on that?
Look, frankly, I think he makes a compelling case. I mean, there are protections here that have been, closely considered when making these restrictions.
Well, I don't want to ask him, since you called him, does he think we should take cameras out of state courtrooms too? What did he tell you about that?
I think that he believes that there are some nuances between generally the types of cases that you see in state courts versus federal courts, and that's why this probably makes sense.
Okay, so you call him.
He listens well.
Okay, so you're the two youngest members. I know you're going to bristle at this. You are the rising stars, I think most people would say, in this delegation. Is there competition between the two of you? I've seen you two together. There really is no competition. No, there's not this sense of...
No, because I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm still figuring it out, right? So I call
there's
him for
none of
advice
that
all the
feeling?
time.
There's nothing.
Look, I've said this about Seth to you before. I've said it to a number of people before. From somebody that sat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, to have somebody with his background in part of the Democratic caucus, he brings an extraordinarily valuable viewpoint and experience to these debates in Washington.
That's exactly what I want to talk about. 80% of your colleagues are like him, didn't serve in the military. He talks about the value of your experience, obviously 4 tours of duty, we're aware of that. Are you comfortable, I know how you feel about Joe Kennedy, but are you comfortable that Joe Kennedy and the other 80% who haven't lived that life have the knowledge base to decide whether men and women's lives, like yours, should be put at risk in the name of this country?
I don't think being a veteran should be a litmus test for being a politician, and that's why we have a representative body. So what's important is that people like Joe who don't have that particular experience listen to my perspective in the same way that I listen to his because I haven't been a prosecutor.
Are either of you prepared to vote? America, surprisingly to me, 60% in recent polls say we should commit ground troops to fight ISIS in Iraq or Syria. Are either of you prepared to vote yes should that proposal come before the Congress, starting with you, Congressman Milton?
I have very serious reservations because I don't think we have a strategy to ensure long-term success. What we can't have is more troops going into Iraq, maybe some military victory, but no long-term political solution. And then 5 years down the road, we have to send them back, which is exactly what we're doing now.
So the answer now is no?
Right now, I have tremendous reservations. I want to see a strategy, and then let's decide whether or not we support that strategy with an authorization for the use of military
force. How about you,
force.
Congressman? Can you imagine voting yes on something like that?
Let me say this. I share those same concerns that Seth indicated. I called him on this one too.
Okay.
So we went back and forth on this piece. I have very real concerns, and Seth has outlined the aspects of this that are not just a military engagement, but a political strategy afterwards. The other piece that I would just add is this. Left to continue to fester, you've got Syria is a country of about 18 million people. You've got 4 million refugees that have now spilled over into Jordan, into Iraq, even into Lebanon, into Turkey. This, without additional support, that is a real political strategy of engagement and humanitarian assistance. This is going to get even worse. So the U.S. has to engage on this. This has to move beyond the debate of just ground troops and actually come up with a military and political strategy that tries to address this problem.
We only have 1 minute left. I want to get back to this. You're mid-30s, both of you. Congressman Lynch and Congressman Capuano were here a couple of weeks ago. I asked them about the leadership. Lynch said Nancy Pelosi should go. Capuano, who's very close to her, came pretty close. 75 years old. Harry Reid outgoing 75. To use the president's term, you were shellacked in the midterm elections in 2010. Largest Republican majority in almost a century in 2014. Quickly, if you can, Joe Kennedy, is it not time for new leadership to bring the Democratic Party into this century?
Jim, as you know, I'm excuse me, I am a supporter of Leader Pelosi. I've been in the rooms with her over the course of the past couple of years. Her advocacy for democratic values, what she does in terms of leading this party, there's a reason why she's a leader. And so I'm happy to support her. She has broadened the tent a bit and giving folks like Seth and other younger members a chance to make their voices heard, which I think is
comfortable with her too?
I am comfortable with her, but I've always said I'll make a decision based on who's running. I'm not going to, we'll see who runs next time. If someone runs against her, then I'll consider that. But I'll tell you, I have been also impressed by her leadership. She's a quiet leader behind the scenes in a lot of ways that many people don't appreciate.
Joe Kennedy, it's a pleasure to see you.
Always. Thank you.
Seth Moulton, pleasure
Thanks.
to see you as well.
Good to see you.
Congressman, really appreciate it.